Thank you, Dr. Rakesh Kumar, for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Neville and Dr. Rakesh both. There is Niri and Mumbai first for inviting me to this very interesting webinar on a obviously very important topic. Let me begin by some uh, preliminary clarification, which is that I'm not going to be talking about Mumbai. I haven't done water-related research in Mumbai. My research has been further south, Bangalore and Tamil Nadu. And secondly, I'm not really going to be talking about the particular topic that has been chosen for today's session. Today's session focuses, the rest of the speakers are focusing primarily on wastewater treatment, whereas my talk is much broader. I hope the message that I have in this talk is valid for all the 3 days. It's about how we think about smart and sustainable water management, not specifically about Mumbai or wastewater in particular. Uh, so let me start right away by asking this question: what do we mean when we say we want smart and sustainable water and wastewater management, which is the theme of this conference? And these are terms that are often used in the context of water, energy, broadly environmental management, and so on. So, what do we really mean? And I think there are two problems that we have to confront when we think about uh, these terms. And I don't mean necessarily only these terms. There are other ways in which people articulate the idea of water management. One thing is whether we are keeping our goals too narrow. So the term sustainable, for instance, I've been working with this term for the last 30, 40 years, and the origin of the idea of sustainability is something that can continue forever. Subsequently, people have also replaced sustainability with the idea of resilience and said, well, we want it to be resilience to climate shock and so on and so forth. But both sustainability and resilience are really forward looking or future looking concepts, saying what I have today needs to continue tomorrow or needs to be available for future generations. And that's great and that's fine. But the question is that enough? Or really, if you look at how people use the term sustainability now, they really mean green, they mean environmentally sound, and eventually they just mean good environmental management or good management of water and so on. So sustainability has now become a catch-all to capture this idea of environmentally sound, which, if that is what we mean, that's great, but we may want to become more explicit about it. And then further ask the question, is even environmental soundness in the management of water an adequate or a sufficient goal for us to focus on? Because water is really a resource for life, a resource for livelihood. And for many people, they cannot worry about tomorrow's water if they don't have even enough water for today. Uh, Water is also a peculiar resource compared to, let's say, forests, for instance, on which also I work a lot. In the case of forests, if I cut down all the trees today, I will not really have any production of whether it is timber, whether it is sequestration of carbon, whether it is production of any kind of other products, tomorrow. Uh, in the case of water, however, water is a cycling resource, and the cycle is driven by evaporation from the oceans that bring our monsoons and rainfall that then falls on land and flows back to the oceans. Now, this cycle is being disrupted to an extent by human interference in atmospheric processes through climate change, through the emission of CO2 and so on. But that disruption is of a different kind, and it is not related to our use of water. So, there's at some level, it's not really possible to use water unsustainably, because whatever water falls today and whatever fraction of that we use today, um, it's not really going to affect how much water falls tomorrow. That is next in the next monsoon cycle. So in that sense, although there are other ways in which we can worry about unsustainability, it's not about today's use affecting tomorrow's availability of water, except when it comes to groundwater. So we need to really think beyond the idea of sustainability when we are thinking about water. Uh, the second concern I have is that are we sometimes mixing means and ends or means and goals? So, for example, when you say smart water management, what do we really mean? Do we really mean management that is based on the use of information technology, which is a good thing, but again, is it enough? Do we mean not just best information technology, but best all kinds of technology? So, wastewater treatment technology or water supply technology, metering technology, water efficiency related technologies, and so on. Is that what we mean when we say smart water management? Very often we say our goal is efficient water use. Is that really what we mean by smart and sustainable water management? Recycling, rainwater harvesting, these often are ideas or concepts or technologies that substitute for a goal. So we are really using means, but then we say that's really the goal of water management. Or at the other extreme, we say smart when we mean good. And then again, we are back in the same old trap of what do we mean by good? We are not being particularly explicit about that. So in the Karnataka water policy draft that we worked on in the Karnataka Knowledge Commission, we try to push very hard to bring a consensus on what are the real goals of water governance. And we have argued that good water governance, if you want to call it that, has multiple normative dimensions which do not fully overlap. And this is something really important for us to understand. So the idea of adequacy and affordability, for instance, is often at the top of any policy agenda. People need to get enough water. That water needs to be reaching them in an affordable manner, something they can actually get hold of, and not just in quantitative terms, sort of supply divided by number of people. That water has to have a certain quality when it's coming into them. And similarly, the water that we eject from our use systems also needs to meet certain kind of, stay below a certain pollution threshold. We've got equity and justice concerns about how we distribute the water that's available, access to that water. We've obviously got sustainability and resilience concerns. And finally, and this is an important point, that as a goal in and of itself, we need to be thinking of democratic water governance. And I'll come back a little bit to this point about why we think of democracy as a goal in itself. So if we expand on these normative concerns, in this water policy document, we have used the concept of water for life and livelihoods, where the idea of adequacy and affordability is embedded, but also flagging the need of water for other living beings. And that includes water for culture. So we may want to ensure there's minimum e-flows in rivers, not because we want to use them, but because other living beings need that water. And we may want to use certain ways of displaying water or allowing flows in natural ways, which have cultural value in and of itself. When people revere a particular river, it's not just about the fish in that river, it's about that river having cultural value. And of course, there's the issue of quality and e-flows for the consumer and for the ecosystem into which the effluents are released. I've already mentioned the idea of sustainability and resilience, and it's really important when we think of water, groundwater, as part of the hydrological cycle and not something separate, that we think of groundwater, that is the dynamic groundwater which is recharged every year, not as a separate resource, not that something that is over and above the rainfall that's happening there, but really simply as a buffer. It's a storage system which is filled and empties. And the interior storage is something really that is a buffer for bad years to be replenished in good years. We should also be thinking about sustainability, and this point was made earlier by Mr. Maluste also, that financial sustainability is something that we have to worry about, not just ecological or natural resource sustainability. A third dimension really is the footprint of water use. So we might be pumping, in the case of Bangalore, water from 100 kilometers away and 300 meters uphill in order to get that water across, from Kaveri River to Bangalore. That's a massive GHG footprint. I would argue that Bangalore's carbon footprint in its use of water is probably one of the highest in cities in India. And we have to ask this question: is that what we want? And how much of a footprint is reasonable? And what can we do to reduce that footprint? And of course, there's a question of resilience to drought. And then there are these two other points which I have mentioned earlier, which I would like to elaborate upon: the ideas of equity and fairness, and democracy and participation. So let me just get into that in a second. I think my screen is frozen here. Yeah. So I think we have got to elaborate these ideas of equity and fairness quite a bit. Let's start from within the same sector. Let's say the domestic sector. In the domestic sector, we can talk about similar amounts being available for similar needs and equal costs for equal use, the ideas of equity, namely that everybody should have access to a certain amount of water and they should be paying similar amounts. But you could go further and say that social justice requires that weaker sections cannot be charged the same amount of rupee cost or even physical cost as we would charge for richer sections. So that's the idea of social justice. We also have to then think about balancing the demands across sectors, and there's no easy way of saying equal amounts, because what is the equal between industry and domestic? There's no equal amount that we can talk about. So we have to think about fairness rather than equal amount. We have to, most important, and I think this is particularly relevant in the context of Mumbai, which is the fairness to source watersheds. I think the biggest challenge that megalopolitan areas like Mumbai and Bangalore have to address is not so much what scarcity of water for themselves, but the environmental impact that they cause when they divert more and more water from further and further away from newer and newer rivers into them, to get to meet their water requirements. And I think this is very much true in the case of Mumbai, where it's building more and more dams in the Western Ghats and taking away water from those watersheds, displacing people there in large numbers. And the question is, what is a fair way? What is the fair extent of doing this? And of course, there is a fairness to downstream obligations, including oceans. In this case, I mean, is it okay to block all water that goes from west flowing rivers? There's a proposal even in Karnataka saying all the water that goes into the ocean is waste, and we should dam all that water and use it for human use. Is that the right way of looking at our downstream obligations? And finally, the idea of democratic governance. And I think this idea is not really new, but sometimes new to engineers, because as engineers we are brought up upon the idea of technical fixes for every solution. Every problem has a technological fix, but really speaking, problems are not purely technical because they don't have unique solutions. Every problem you could do decentralized wastewater management, you could do centralized wastewater management, you could tackle water efficiency through pricing, you could tackle water or reduce water consumption through technical solutions or through some other solutions. So there are obviously going to be both, as I have mentioned, there are 5 major axes on which normatively itself we may disagree on certain things. How important is equity versus affordability, or how important is equity versus sustainability, or the needs of non-humans versus the needs of humans, and so on and so forth. We will never have 100% agreement on how we weight along those 5 dimensions, and we will never have agreement upon the solutions. Therefore, the question is, how do we choose between these goals, between the goals and between the means for achieving those goals? And the only long-term solution I would suggest is to have a deeper democratic process, a democratic process that is much more democratic than what we see today. The current process, then we get really get scared about. We really sort of turn up our nose in disgust and say this is not the way we want decision making to happen. So we need a much better process that we would call them, deeply democratic process. The elements of which would be decentralization, public participation, transparency, and accountability. And these have to be central in the long run, because as I said, we will never have a situation where we have all agreed upon the goals and we have all agreed upon the means, and then it's just a matter of implementation. So we need a process through which conflicting ideas are tabled, debated, and then resolved in a fair manner. I'll just end with a few insights from Bangalore. They're not exactly matching the Mumbai situation, so I've cherry-picked some of them that have some relevance. And let me just begin with this graph about adequacy and equity in the domestic sector. So one of the things I've seen on the literature on all Indian cities, including Mumbai, is that we have very poor data on what is the distribution of consumption of water per capita per day across the population. We have some numbers. I mean, there are studies in Mumbai which show that although the average of 135 is being met, but really there are people in slums which are having to make do with 25 or 50 liters per capita per day. Here is a graph of a histogram for Bangalore, which is based upon a 1,500 household sample that IIM Bangalore and we jointly analyzed. And it shows again that if one wants to look at the mean, it's 120, which looks pretty okay. But the median is 85 liters per capita per day, which means 50% of the consumers are below even a 90 LPCD norm. And yet 10% are above 225 LPCD. Their average consumption is 340. So there's a huge disparity between the consumption in the population. And one could argue that if we were asked tomorrow, what is the biggest water problem in Bangalore? I would arguably say the unequal distribution of access to water is the biggest problem, not so much the water of absolute scarcity. There's no meaning to talk about absolute scarcity when one chunk of the population has 400 LPCD and another has 40 LPCD. So it's clear that only some fraction of the population is facing scarcity. So we have to talk about the question of inequitable water access. Let me just add a few more layers to that. If you look at the way price is charged to water consumers in Bangalore, it ranges all the way from 8 to 24 rupees per kiloliter for similar use. Commercial and industrial consumers are charged 80 rupees per kiloliter, and the obvious consequence is that they switch to bore wells. So there is a real downside to trying to jack up prices for commercial consumers too much. There are industries that get Kaveri water, but not households. we are not really sure what is Bangalore's legitimate share in Kaveri water. We keep talking about adding more and more stages to the Kaveri water supply system, as there's an unlimited river water availability downstream. And similarly, we are talking about these massive diversions from further and further away from newer and newer rivers like the Netravati and Sharavati. So as you can see, Bangalore is certainly not meeting any kind of standard of equity and fairness internally as well as externally. I'm just going to end with this one slide, which is about industrial pollution. Since today's session is also about treatment of effluents, our observation is that except for these, these photographs are special. We caught the effluent at the right time. Overall, if this graph, this is a very painstaking work done by my colleague, Dr. Jambal at ATRI, where she monitored a stream coming out of an industrial area 24 hours a day for 12 months. So they did 12 rounds of monitoring. And what they see is basically that all the heavy metals are peaking between, say, midnight and 8 a.m. So that's really when the industries are discharging their effluents, knowing very well that that makes them invisible and non-monitorable. And who's suffering? Well, it's basically downstream farmers who are using this water for irrigation, and then that baby corn is being consumed by Bangaloreans. So that's a kind of an interesting payback that we are getting in terms of our industrial effluents. Finally, let me just end with the idea of democratic and participatory governance. So we actually have a different system from Mumbai. The case of Mumbai, it's Mumbai Mahanagarpalika itself, which is managing water. But in the case of Bangalore, we have a professional body, a board set up in the 60s, and some would say that's a great thing. It's an ultra-professional board, only engineers in it. But what that means is that citizens of Bangalore do not even have access to BWSSB's plans. They cannot govern the utility that services them. Even BBMP, through their municipality, we do not have a say in what BWSSB does. We do not own our wastewater. Our wastewater is then promised to a power plant. It is promised to somebody else. So the idea of reducing or recycling our wastewater itself is getting undermined. We do not control the lakes within our limit. And of course, in a larger democratic sense, the rural hinterland has no say in how and when water will be diverted to Bangalore. So let me just end here and say we've got, and this is probably true of all cities in India. This is true of Mumbai in different ways, slightly perhaps, but the questions of adequacy and fairness, the questions of sustainability and pollution, and the questions of democratic control are, I think, applicable across the board. And I think we need to really figure out ways to approach those goals, those multiple goals simultaneously as we go along. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, now we are coming to the final part, and that is the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Dr. Lele. And you will see all the panelists, and they will brainstorm amongst themselves about certain issues that, and maybe take up one or two questions also from the question answer session. Over to Dr. Lele.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Mehta. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
And it's been a privilege to be part of this panel with Dr. Salvi, with Samrat from Liorai, with Priyank, and I'm missing Dr. Majumdar. Is Dr. Majumdar there? I'm not seeing him in one of these small windows. Let me go ahead. I'm assuming that Dr. Majumdar will join. I know that the person from Israel, Dr. Dan, he had to bail out for some other meeting. I picked a few questions from the Q&A, and also there are some questions that I would like to throw at the panel in order to get some going. There's one question on which there's been a lot of back and forth in the Q&A panel itself. So let me just address that one first, which is somebody asked, what is the fraction of domestic water use, industrial water use in the country, let us say. And we all know that these numbers are while the precise numbers are difficult, domestic water use tends to be less than 10%, and of blue water use. Now, one of the things we have to remember is that the distinction between blue water use and green water use, where if rain falls on a rain-fed crop or it falls on a forest, and the forest uses that water for transpiration, that is considered as green water use. If the crop is a rain-fed crop, that is also green water use. And blue water use pertains to that water that we actually pull out of streams, rivers, or the groundwater, and then apply it to either agriculture or use it in industry or the household. That's your blue water use. But even in the context of blue water use, the amount of domestic use is a very small fraction, somewhere under 10%. It will vary from country to country a little bit. The related question was, the point I made was that if you want to look at the water problem for a country as a whole and not for a city, then we should be really looking at our indirect water footprint, not so much the water I use in the form of turning on my tap, which is, let's say, 150 LPCD, but the water that is embedded in the food that I eat, which could be as high as 3,000 liters per capita per day. Because if I'm eating a lot of rice, if I'm eating a lot of sugar, if I'm eating a lot of vegetables in the off season or fruit, that's going to be much more water intensive use in agriculture. And that's my hidden water use or my embedded water footprint. And so there's been this back and forth in the Q&A about, isn't 3,000 liters per capita per day too high? And the answer is no. I think if you calculate rainfall for the whole of India, that number is much higher. So it's not as if we are consuming all that water through this embedded water use, but that's the difference between your in-house water use directly and the indirect footprint that we carry. So at the scale of state water policy or national water policy, we need to put in as much effort on reducing our indirect water footprint, for example, by changing our diets, as much as we should be on reducing our urban water footprint, as in the direct water use in the city. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up that discussion. And then there are questions here for various speakers. So for Dr. Salvi, I noted a couple of questions which are linked. One was, there are large layouts now that are being required by the municipality to do their own water treatment. Large layouts, possibly even large buildings. That's certainly the case in Bangalore. So what has been the experience with that policy? Is it succeeding? To what extent? And another question is from my side, which is, of the wastewater that is treated in Bombay today, what fraction is actually being, let us say, sold or even given for industrial or commercial or basically non-potable reuse by the municipal water treatment plants? Is there a particular fraction? I know that in Bangalore, although all plants are secondary treatment or above, the fraction is 1%. Of the installed capacity. So I just wanted a similar number. So if you could answer these two questions, and I'll take up the other.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dr. Lele. The first question is about the big layouts and all. So definitely in our development plan and all, or new layouts, there is a conditions for what separate STPs or rainwater harvesting and all such connections, all such conditions are made. Even we are just at those were old layouts also, and comparatively big housing complexes, if they can recycle the water, recycle the wastewater, and if they are using it, we are giving certain percentage of the benefit in the assessment tax as is a sort of award to them. So that is also we are doing. It is applicable to solid waste and other also, but our discussion is related to wastewater. So any housing complex, if they do the recycle and reuse of the wastewater, there is a certain percentage of the concession or subsidy is given in their assessment tax. That is what the first general overall answer. Second is concern. If you recollect my presentation, as I said, particularly Mumbai, everybody will agree. In general, we are providing sufficient quantity of water to the public. In general. So when you talk about to go for the recycled water, I repeat my sentence. Even today also, our public is under impression yesterday's water is a stale water. So when they are not using that and they are just throwing it because it is stale water, and now we are going for what, telling that use the treated water, wastewater. It is a big challenge for us. But to be very frank, we are doing decentralized level. We are doing certain part of the treatment and trying to supply to the gardens and all. At our, say, particularly at Dadar, there is a small plant, and we have done some treatment and using that particular water for the gardening. Even from one plant, some water is also, we are planning to give it to the Raj Bhavan also. Some water is used by the RCF. Even the racecourse, for racecourse gardening purpose, this recycled water is used. But if you talk about the revenue and all, say at this stage, it is not a big thing. So that is the reason. Even our Kulaba plant is already commissioned. We are planning to give some part of the treated water to the military authorities, military, army and navy, so that they can use it again. So this is the big challenge for us. though we are treating, if we treat it and the sufficient treated water is available, how to make use of that, and that is a big challenge for us. But definitely we'll do it in next 5
Thank you.
years.
I must
Thank you.
congratulate the Mumbai municipality for giving these financial incentives, because one of the biggest problems in Bangalore, and I had a slide which I omitted because of lack of time. We have showed that the cost of doing your own STP, running your own STP in a large apartment complex, can still be quite prohibitive and leads to the apartments not wanting to take it up or cheating, because in Bangalore it is mandatory and there is no incentive. So I think the incentive approach is a much better approach. Thank you. A question for Dr. Mazumdar. Two questions actually, really, which is A, for slums in particular, what modification of the approach that you had mentioned, the DWATS approach, which is a little bit land intensive and so on and so forth. For slums, do you have a modified model that might work? And there is also a question about, can we develop technologies that do not use water as a medium of sanitation? So rather an extreme solution to the sanitation question.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, and even before I start, I'd like to mention one thing, because I was just raising my hand with Dr. Alvi's reply. You see, I do believe that our municipalities, municipal corporations, they should have interacting planning on a long-term basis. So you see, setting up a sewage treatment plant is a huge issue. It's not only land, but a huge capital intensive thing. So initially, the people should be consulted, and even the builders can be consulted, and a decision can be made as to what would be the approximate percentage of such buildings, such housing complexes, which would like to have their independent system. Then that much can be taken out of the centralized system. Otherwise, you see, long back, I have had a chance to study a couple of STPs in different cities. What was happening, because of lack of connection, the STPs were set up. Because of lack of connection, they were, under capacity, about 50%, 40%. This was one. And during the rainy season, because the surface drainage was somehow linked, so the BOD, COD was just, it was like a river water. So that is why when we plan, we should have this in our mind that, okay, for the next 30 years, we are making a plan. So we can have a plan with the builders, with the others, and even the cooperative group housing societies, and see who would like to have solid waste management inside their campus and to what extent, because everything cannot be done within their campus. Similarly for wastewater also. Now, coming to the questions that have been put to me, you see, I do believe personally that for any situation, whether it's a slum or a city, urban area, whatever, so first one has to examine the site and the site conditions. Yes, it is possible. First of all, the most important thing is, what is the load? That means, what is the total population of the slum? What is the system? Do they have a community toilet, or some of them have household toilets also? What is the system? Or they have what you call the temporary roll-on, roll-off kind of toilets. So that situation has to be seen. And then how much water they are getting. Because even last year I have seen in Delhi, you see, toilets were there in slums. We were studying some 10 slums, out of which 2 were picked up, which were the worst affected. And we saw that toilets were there in both, but they were highly, underrated. So for, let's say, about 4,000 people, the facility was for 500 people. And therefore, they had also provided certain box type plastic made, FRP and plastic made box type toilets. They were just stashed in the, in the premise of the community toilet. Now what was happening is, these had to be sucked out. The material had to be sucked out every evening, but it was not happening. A. B, it was again under capacity. So more people were coming. So therefore it was all filled up. And it was so much, everybody was so unhappy about the thing. So therefore the situation has to be looked into whether land would be available, how much land would be available, and whether the material has to be taken out of the slum. Because in some slums, it may be that the site is so small that you cannot do anything there. So in that case, maybe it has to be taken out and done somewhere else. But otherwise, if some land is available, a design can be made. And DWATS is a very, it's a very flexible kind of a system. Basically, what we started, the design, I mean, the engineers amongst all of you would remember the Imhoff tank. So we took the Imhoff tank as our first block of design. And from there we started and we designed different kinds of systems. And for each place, each site, our design was different. I mean, of course, these were pilot. So the answer is that yes, it can be done, but it would depend, the design would depend on the ground situation. And the second thing is without water. Yes, without water systems are there. It's a well-known system. For example, in Africa, it's called the VIP toilet, ventilated improved pit toilet. Even DVIP is there. So double ventilated improved pit toilet. Now, this is possible, but with our mindset, it is difficult. And secondly, for ablution, water cannot be used because then there would be ponding. That is one. And in Sweden also, they have a somewhat similar toilet, which is called Miltrum. Now in Miltrum, they also put the domestic green waste into the toilet. So a lot of compost is produced. There the, most of the households have more space. So the use is much better. So it is possible, but it doesn't fit with our mindset. That is the problem.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a question now to Dr. To Mr. Hirani and to the other panelists also, which is basically about the monitoring question, right? So Priyank, you said something about the once a month monitoring really not being of any particular use. And I was just wondering whether, although we also have been heavy critics of the monitoring protocols that have been followed, and I give you that heavy metal example where all the spikes are happening at night. Maybe for domestic sewage, so if you're measuring BOD, maybe it's okay to measure once a month because there's not really going to be any huge spikes, and diurnal variations you can kind of figure out once and then do the monitoring at the right time. So I'm just putting it to you that maybe we don't have to resort to 24/7 monitoring for each and every. Is that right, or would you suggest some other approach?
Yes, no, absolutely agree. I'm sorry if my presentation it came out in any other way. You're right. So not all parameters need to have the same frequency of monitoring, but there are certainly some parameters that can be measured and can be measured in an easier way than just doing it once a month. Again, the example that you took for heavy metals, for example, the change in heavy metals in any water body is going to be even slower to notice, right? So you don't even need like once a month monitoring for heavy metals. If you do it once every few months, that's almost going to give you the same results for what you would have seen. The parameters that do see a change, and those are sort of initial indicators of the water quality, are mainly like pH, dissolved oxygen, electrical conductivity, to sort of give you an idea about whether there was a sudden discharge of domestic waste or industrial waste into the water because you see a spike in EC values on that particular day. Or DO, for example, varies throughout a day also.
Yeah, thank you. So looking at the clock, it's already 5:30. We are 30 minutes past the closing time. I thought we would close the discussion here. I wanted to, however, pick up on the points that Samrat made towards the end. Also, Priyank and Dr. Mazumdar, and in a way complementing what Dr. Salvi had said, which was that the need to break down silos. So Priyank made this point about elite monitoring versus people's monitoring and the need to bridge the two and make data available to absolutely the common person. And I thought that was an excellent point. Samrat mentioned the point about the silos between different sectors. So we think about flood, we don't think about wastewater. When we think about wastewater, we don't think about fresh water, and so we're kind of making these silos that need to be broken, and also the silos between building plans, infrastructure, the way we regulate our infrastructure, and the whole question of flooding and so on. So that those silos need to be broken. I think Dr. Majumdar made the point about how micro level or decentralized wastewater treatment needs to be part of the planning process and not something that comes as a patch-up job later on when things fall between the cracks, and the centralized treatment gets all the attention, all the money, and then a whole bunch of people are never going to be part of that grid system, and then we go in with decentralized kind of patch-up jobs, and why not it get integrated? So I think Dr. Salvi's response in terms of how the Mumbai Municipal Corporation has integrated, at least to some extent, the requirement that large layouts or large buildings do their own STPs into an incentivization process by changing their tax assessments. It shows to me actually that the professionalization of water supply and sewerage treatment need not happen outside in its own silo, which I would call the Bangalore approach, where you have a separate BWSSB which then doesn't talk to the municipality. It will not give you any property tax concessions because it does not control property tax. So if you're not connected to BWSSB's grid, what incentive can BWSSB give you, in terms of doing your own sewage treatment, right? So the integration of water and water sewerage and flood control, to pick up Samrat's point, into the municipal management of the city as a whole is, I think, the starting of the process of integrated management. And so I saw this as a common thread that emerged across all the speakers. I wanted to highlight that when we say integrated management, it's about not just integrating fresh water, wastewater, flood water, imported water. It's also about the city development planning, or the way we plan space, or the way we regulate buildings with the water supply system and the sewerage system, and then ultimately different departments being integrated through a common idea of a urban local government. So with those closing remarks, I'd like to close this session, and from my behalf also thank all the speakers for really interesting presentations, interesting insights that their vast experience has given us. I wanted to also thank the audience. We had audience of 100 till almost the very end. I think we had a little bit of a drop towards the end, but a lot of interesting questions. I'm sure we didn't answer all of your questions. There is a whole lot of material out there that I'm sure you can use to answer some of your questions. But I'm sure Mumbai First and NEERI themselves will act as resources as they hold many of these webinars and bring these kind of people together in the future as well. Thank you.